Hello, I'm going to talk about a mathematical challenge. This is to construct a model of history or historical change using the mathematics of Quaternions. There are several reasons for being interested in Quaternions, including that they have four components which map naturally onto four key sociological variables. And that if we get solutions of the form e to the qt, where q is a quaternion, they will have both exponential and cyclical components, the two types of historical change. To begin then, I want to make some broad points about scientific explanation and the possibility of a scientific theory of history. Then I will discuss the value of having such a theory. Finally, I will outline my suggested approach using quaternions. There can be a tendency for physical scientists to see social science as soft and rather easy, and to be overconfident of the ability to tackle it. If social science appears unsophisticated or imprecise, it is because the problems of social science are actually that much harder than those of physical science. Social scientists may not yet have developed consensus theories like those of other disciplines, but what they have come to appreciate is that the everyday notions we have about how society works are generally naive and simplistic. Let me give an analogy. If you introduce someone to Newton's first law, that an object will continue in uniform motion until acted on by a force, they may find it difficult to accept because it conflicts with their everyday intuition that you need to apply a force to something to keep it in motion. To help them develop their intuition, you could refer to a stone skimming on an icy pond, but this is an imperfect example since such a stone will still eventually slow down. The fact is that Newton's first law cannot be proven by exhibiting an actual object moving free of all forces. We accept it as valid because of the conclusions that follow from it. There are 2 points of relevance here. First, I will be making theoretical assertions and giving examples in order to justify them, but these are not proofs of my statements. They are imperfect illustrations designed to aid intuition. Whether the theory is worthwhile depends on where we can go with it, and that has yet to be determined. Second, the abstractions we will be dealing with may well conflict with what common experience teaches us to expect. However, common experience is not a good guide because of interfering factors, and the deeper principles may only reveal themselves after careful thought and consideration. Some people nevertheless argue that a theory of history is impossible, for which they give various arguments. I won't deal with these as such. I will just say that I reject all a priori arguments. The only true way to be sure of what is possible or not is to have a go. Now, in what follows, I'm going to be using a dynamical systems approach based on differential calculus. However, John von Neumann argued that calculus was developed to solve the problems of physics, and that social scientists would likely need their own mathematics. I would therefore see what I am presenting as a clumsy attempt to capture the ideas using a familiar paradigm, while recognising that it needs different and possibly entirely new mathematics to express them properly. To turn to applications, beyond simple intellectual curiosity, there are some practical reasons for wanting a theory of historical change. First, governments wish to manage their economies and influence other outcomes for their citizens with health services, policing, welfare, and so on. To some extent, they use models to forecast needs and to assess the impact of potential interventions such as a change in taxation. However, they do not always get it right, and there can be economic downturns and social unrest. A model based on thousands of years of historical change should help governments take more informed decisions. Second, unrest and instability overseas affects the UK, for example via immigration, reduced access to markets and raw materials, and the need to provide military or humanitarian support in the event of conflicts and crises. The UK has long been interested in supporting overseas development, since it is to everyone's advantage to establish other countries as stable, reliable and prosperous global partners. Yet corruption, poverty and conflict persist. A model of historical change would make it easier to anticipate crises with upstream prevention, and in the longer term would help governments and international agencies to construct better development strategies. Third, adversaries such as hostile regimes or terrorist networks grow and evolve. A deeper understanding of how such groups develop over time would mean being able to predict emerging threats and identify vulnerabilities that make it possible to divert the groups down alternative paths to disruption and fragmentation. So a theory of historical change would help manage or prevent various kinds of social problem and would repay the investment put into it. Let me turn now to the details of the challenge. I will start with generalities and proceed to nuances. History exhibits two types of change, linear and cyclical. By linear, I particularly mean exponential, or at least accelerating. Linear accelerating change is seen in the growth of the human population. It's also seen in human technological capacities, for example, in transport. Cyclical change affects what are commonly recognised as the political, economic and social spheres of society. The rise and fall of empires constitutes a political cycle. Financial booms and busts constitute an economic cycle. And the Harvard sociologist Pitirim Sorokin identified a social cycle in which societies oscillate between individualist and communitarian styles of culture. Now, while I said that population and technology exhibit linear growth, there is also a cyclical element, since growth is faster at some times than at others, and can even go backwards. Similarly, while I said that the political, economic and social spheres are characterised by cycles, there is also linear growth. Consider Egypt. It's one of the poorer countries in the world today, yet thousands of years ago it was probably the richest. In this sense, it is in the down phase of a long economic cycle. Nevertheless, the economic activity of modern Egypt is far more vigorous than that of pharaonic times, with a much greater diversity of goods and services supporting many more people. In other words, there has been overall economic progress or linear change. The same can be argued for political and social affairs. What we seem to see here is an interaction between population and technology growth on the one hand, and political, economic and social cycles on the other hand. That is, political, economic and social cycles can retard or accelerate the growth of population and technology, while the linear growth of population and technology tends to raise the whole level of political, economic and social activity. Let me now add a little more depth and precision to these points. Instead of talking about population and technology, I will talk about scale. Scale is a measure of the intensity of social interaction. It is increased by the growth of human numbers and by technologies that allow people to live at higher densities, to move around more quickly, or to communicate over greater distances. Hence, scale, as a measure of social interactivity, wraps up in one concept a whole range of things like population, urbanism, agricultural productivity, transport and communications, in which there has been overall progress and human development. To see that population and technology are not independent and that it makes sense to tie them together, consider an idealistic commune of, say, 500 people who set out to be completely self-sufficient and isolated from the rest of the world. Here, outside the commune, we have computers with ever better chips and ever improved operating systems with ever more apps to run on them. If the members of the commune want this, they are going to have to design and manufacture their own chips and write their own apps and operating systems. It is not going to happen. There are simply not enough of them to do all that needs to be done, while also growing their food, making their clothes and maintaining their shelter. If they want mechanical tractors, they not only will have to build them, but will have to locate, extract and refine the oil and the metal ores, having first built suitable refineries. Again, it is not going to happen. So they won't have metal, and without metal they won't have electricity. Such a commune will inevitably be reduced to Neolithic technology. It's not just that population limits technology, but technology limits population. A city like modern New York simply could not exist on Neolithic lines. Population growth and technological progress go together as chicken and egg, it makes sense to wrap them up in the single theme of scale. Scale, then, is a measure of how many people we interact with. While these interactions do not have to be face-to-face, in buying goods that were made by people far away so that a portion of our money gets back to them, we are interacting with them. Scale also depends on how much of our time is spent interacting with these people, i.e. whether we are interacting with them once a year or day in, day out. Precisely how to define and measure scale is part of the challenge. However, I will briefly suggest the following entropy-style definition. We define scale, S, from the perspective of a particular person as equal to minus the sum of Zi log Zi, where Zi is the fraction of your time spent interacting with the ith other person. So it measures the diversity of social interaction from the perspective of a particular individual. The scale of a whole society might then be an average or some other measure constructed from the individual scales. To turn to the political, economic and social dimensions of society, the idea that there are three such dimensions should itself be regarded as a theoretical assertion. Some authors have explicitly argued that these are indeed the three critical dimensions by which we should study societies, and the idea is tacitly assumed much more widely. Nevertheless, not everyone agrees. Others have argued for a larger number of dimensions, or sometimes for just one. I favour the adoption of three dimensions because they can be directly related to three modes by which one person can influence another's behaviour, and these three modes seem to me to be necessary and sufficient. The three modes of influence are coercive, contractual and cooperative. Consider A influencing B. In the coercive mode, corresponding to the political dimension, A makes B do something. In the contractual mode, corresponding to the economic dimension, A does something for B in return for B doing something for A. Or we can say A pays or bribes B. In the cooperative mode, B does something for A spontaneously. There is no need for either a threat or a reward. B cares about A's well-being, shares A's values, or has common interests with A, and cannot be fully happy unless A is also happy. So B does something for A through being made to do it, paid to do it, or wanting to do it anyway. I say three modes are necessary because being mugged for your change feels different from buying a newspaper with it, and I think it makes sense to call one an instance of coercion and the other an instance of voluntary exchange or contract, despite some people wanting to call them both exchanges. I say three modes are sufficient because other proposed dimensions can be reduced to some combination of these three, so long as they are interpreted abstractly enough. For example, a military dimension can be seen as a form of coercion and subsumed under the political dimension. To continue, I would now like to introduce a succession of supporting concepts. First, there is the concept of an actor. Coercive, contractual and cooperative interactions do not just occur between individual people. It is also possible for one country to coerce another, for a contractual arrangement to exist between two firms, or for two cities to behave cooperatively. I will therefore use the general term actor, which can be a person but can also be a collective entity like a country, a firm or a city. Next, I will define relationship. A relationship exists between actors A and B when B's behaviour is influenced by A's behaviour. Notice that a relationship is directed. It goes from A to B. Often, perhaps even always, actors will have mutual influence over each other's behaviour, but it is not clear that this is logically necessary. David Beckham can influence me without me influencing David Beckham. Even where influence is mutual, it may not have the same strength or use the same mode in each direction. Therefore, it's better to regard relationship as referring to an exertion of influence in one direction only, albeit that most actors will have mutual complementary relationships. Next, I will define power, wealth and legitimacy as referring to the exertion of coercive, contractual and cooperative influence respectively. An actor that exerts much coercive influence over other actors has power. An actor that exerts much contractual influence over other actors has wealth, and an actor that exerts much cooperative influence over other actors has legitimacy. This is not saying that one needs power to exert coercive influence. It is saying that having coercive influence over a large number of other actors is power. Others, of course, may use the terms differently. However, these are the meanings they have in the present context. At this point, I wish to acknowledge potential confusion surrounding the word social. I have been using it in contradistinction to political and economic, but it can also be used to include political and economic, for example when we say social behaviour, and I will use it that way too. In effect, the word has a narrow technical meaning and a looser everyday meaning, in the same way as words like force and pressure. Some authors have dealt with this confusion by using alternative terms of their own invention, but I prefer to stick with the usual terms and rely on context for clarification. Next, we need to recognise that the three modes of influence and three corresponding dimensions of society are abstractions. We seldom or never see them in pure form. In real situations, they are usually all present to varying extents. We obey the police not just because they have powers of arrest, but perhaps also because we recognise they have a role that benefits us all, and because we respect the tough job they do, i.e. not just for coercive reasons, but also for contractual and cooperative ones. Political, then, does not just refer to what might be seen in the politics section of a newspaper. It refers to any kind of coercive behaviour, and mugging in this sense belongs to the political dimension. What distinguishes a mugging from, say, state taxation is that the government has legitimacy, which the mugger does not. In other words, the government's demands, unlike those of the mugger, activate the cooperative and indeed contractual modes of influence, insofar as we recognise that tax pays for infrastructure and social insurance from which we benefit. Now, a relationship exists between two actors. When many actors are joined together in a collective entity, there will be a whole network of relationships connecting together the various pairs of actors. Indeed, there will be three such networks, one of coercive relationships, one of contractual, and one of cooperative. I will now introduce three concepts that refer to the effectiveness of each of these networks in influencing behaviour within the collective. First, political integration refers to the extent to which the behaviour of a collective is governed by coercive relationships. It may vary from complete anarchy to absolute dictatorship. The term integration, like integer or integral, elicits the notion of wholeness, with a fully integrated collective acting as one, being subjected to a single will. Second, economic organisation refers to the extent to which behaviour is governed by contractual relationships. It can vary from complete self-sufficiency of each actor to a complete division of labour, with each actor providing some specialist service to the rest of the collective. The term organisation, like organism or organs of the body, elicits the notion of division into complementary parts. Third, social cohesion refers to the extent to which behaviour is governed by cooperative relationships. It can vary from extreme selfishness to extreme loyalty and commitment. The term cohesion elicits a notion of sticking together. The precise definition of integration, organisation and cohesion is part of the challenge. What we can say is it should depend in some way on the strength, number and pattern of relationships within each network. Now, when I defined a relationship as being when one actor influences another actor's behaviour, I tacitly assumed that the second actor would behave in a way that the first actor wants. However, sometimes the actors may be enemies, and rather than simply ignoring the first actor, which would imply zero relationship, the second actor may behave deliberately in a way the first actor does not want. It makes sense to refer to this oppositional behaviour as constituting a negative relationship. If relationships can be negative, then integration, organisation and cohesion, which result from networks of such relationships, can also be negative. As the Roman Empire declined so that the imperial government struggled to raise taxes and control crime, its integration could be said to have decreased. and when the empire finally broke up into a number of independent states, its integration could be said to have gone negative. Now, where I said that there are political, economic and social cycles, we should now see that we can regard these as cycles in integration, organisation and cohesion. The next point to consider is how these three quantities interact. I will assert that each quantity can affect each other quantity, both positively and negatively. I will briefly justify this assertion for just one interaction, that between integration and organisation, so as not to make this too tedious and time-consuming. I also recall that this justification, like a stone skimming on ice for Newton's first law, is an imperfect illustration whose aim is to establish the plausibility of something that cannot be directly observed. So, to show that integration has a positive effect on organisation. When the Romans conquered Britain in the 1st century AD, they pacified the countryside, laid down roads, provided protection for markets, and standardised weights, measures, and the coinage. All this made it easier for merchants to operate, and Britain underwent a commercial boom. Integration led to organisation. To show that integration has a negative effect on organisation. A feature of the Roman Empire and of many states through history was the expansion of government bureaucracy, until overtaxation and over-regulation squeezed the life out of the economy. Integration undermined organisation. To show that organisation has a positive effect on integration. The increased wealth of Roman Britain brought higher tax revenues, which the Romans could then reinvest in armies, police, roads, the civil service, and other mechanisms of coercion. Organisation assisted integration. To show that organisation has a negative effect on integration. Free enterprise is a challenge to government control, and authoritarian regimes are often keen to limit it. The more that people are interacting with each other for their private business, the harder it is to dominate them. The accumulation of wealth in private hands can also undermine political authority. Organisation inhibits integration. The idea that integration, organisation and cohesion can affect each other both positively and negatively may seem contradictory. Precisely how this comes about is part of the challenge. However, part of the story may be that how any two quantities affect each other, i.e. whether positively or negatively, depends on the third quantity. Another part of the story may be a distinction between the perceived and real values of each quantity, which then have different effects. When people obey speed limits, it is based on their perception that the limit will be enforced, rather than on the reality of whether the speed cameras have film in and police patrol cars are active and nearby. In general, people's behaviour is influenced by what they perceive the coercive relationships to be, rather than by the reality. The same is true of contractual and cooperative relationships. The real state is difficult or impossible to know, and people act instead on their perceptions. Perception and reality affect each other. It is perhaps only to be expected that perception should tend to catch up with reality. If the government is powerful, people should eventually realise it is powerful. However, it also works the other way round. Reality can catch up with perception. If the government is perceived to be powerful, then people are more likely to obey it, which makes it easier for the government to assert control in reality. Another distinction we need to make is that between internal and external integration, organisation and cohesion. If we take a collective actor like a country or a business firm, it has an internal integration, organisation and cohesion due to the network of relationships among the sub-actors of which it is composed. At the same time, it participates in a wider collective and so experiences an external integration, organisation and cohesion due to the interactions between itself and its peers. This is important because the internal and external variables affect each other. What is more, this can be either positively or negatively. A strong central government can bolster the authority of a local government, and it is easier for a town to become prosperous if it is part of a prosperous country. Hence, the external variables have a positive effect on the internal variables. However, the central government can limit the powers of local government, and an active national economy can produce centralisation, sucking businesses away from the town. In this case, the external variables have a negative effect on the internal ones. This internal-external interaction implies that any model we produce has to be expressed and solved recursively. Collective actors are composed of other collective actors, which are composed of other collective actors, and so on. A business firm is located in a town, which is part of a country which belongs to the international system. If at each level there is an interaction between internal and external variables, then to understand the evolution of any level, we need to consider the evolution of every level. The model is recursive because each level is characterized by exactly the same coercive, contractual, and cooperative interactions. Since there seems to be nothing necessary or fundamental about the way we divide a social system into levels, the solution should turn out to be the same whichever way we choose, and this is an additional constraint that may help in determining a solution. To return to scale, like integration, organisation and cohesion, it also has perceived real and external-internal components. Furthermore, the way that scale changes depends on integration, organisation and cohesion. Specifically, integration, organisation and cohesion exert a brake on the growth of scale because they inhibit innovation, i.e. the new technologies and new institutions that increase scale by allowing people to live more densely or interact more easily. To see how integration, organisation and cohesion hold back innovation, think of how the transistor was invented in America after the Second World War, but exploited by the Japanese. The American electronics companies had thriving businesses based on thermionic valves. To take up the transistor would have meant redesigning all their products and replacing their production lines, with knock-on effects for their distribution and retail networks. The Japanese had no such networks holding them back. Their industries had been destroyed by the war. They were starting from scratch with nothing to lose. Hence, the high organisation experienced by the Americans inhibited their willingness to innovate, whereas the low organisation of the Japanese encouraged innovation. To put it another way, the destruction of Japan's industries allowed it to be more creative. This idea that destruction is necessary for creativity can be termed the Phoenix principle. It implies that success leads to failure and failure leads to success. When people succeed, they become reluctant to change what works. When people fail, they have every incentive to try something different. As a result, the world moves on, and the successful people find their formula stops working like it did. This is how success turns into failure, and failure turns into success. In short, the Phoenix principle means that cycles in innovation, or in the rate of change of scale, are in antiphase to cycles of integration, organisation and cohesion. To summarise then, we have four basic variables: integration, organisation, cohesion and scale, which are divided first into real and perceived components, and then again into internal and external components. This gives a total of 16 variables, each one of which may interact with all the others, including itself. These are what we need to build into a model. Now let us see what quaternions can do for us. A quaternion has the form Q equals W plus XI plus YJ plus ZK, where I, J and K are different square roots of -1, such that I squared equals J squared equals K squared equals I, J, K equals -1. This rule has the implication that quaternion multiplication is non-commutative, so that, for example, IJ equals K, but Ji equals minus K. The order of multiplication matters. Now, suppose that we represent the state of a society by a quaternion, which I'll write as R equals S for scale plus I for integration times I plus O for organisation times J plus C for cohesion times K. Now suppose we have a model of historical change that suggests a society's state changes at a rate proportional to its existing state. This is plausible since the rate of change of scale depends on innovation, which depends on the flow of ideas, which depends on social interaction, which depends on scale. Similarly, power and wealth flow most easily to those who are already powerful and wealthy. So in symbols, we would have the rate of change of the society's state, R dot, varies as the existing state, R. The solution to such an equation would be a Quaternion exponential of the form R equals e to the qt, which we can expand as e to the wt plus xti plus ytj plus ztk, which we can further expand as e to the wt into cos rt plus x upon r sine rti plus y upon r sine rtj plus z upon r sine rtk, where r is the square root of x squared plus y squared plus z squared. The final expansion there is simply an extension of Euler's formula for complex numbers to quaternions. So here we have the parts, remember, corresponding to scale, I, integration, organisation and cohesion. And what we can see is that we immediately have the two types of historical change, an exponential, linear, and cyclical with the sines and cosines. And if we take the part for integration, if we bring out these, it's of the form e to the wt sine rt with an x upon r in it. And here we have this exponential representing the general raising of integration by linear progress through history, and the sine rt represents the cyclical fluctuations in relative integration. So we can regard the whole term as the absolute integration and this sinusoidal part as representing a relative integration. Then by analogy, taking the term for scale, we have it as e to the wt cos rt. We have the whole term representing absolute scale and this cosine term representing a relative scale. Now what this means requires further thought. What does relative scale mean, and does this term in fact represent scale as I defined it earlier? If we take out the exponential part, we have that scale varies as the cosine of rt. That means that s dot, the rate of change of scale, is going to be proportional to minus sine rt. Minus sign compared to the positive sign. That is, the rate of change of scale is in antiphase to integration, organisation and cohesion. And this is precisely what we would expect, as it's consistent with the Phoenix principle. So the factors that make Quaternion algebra an interesting proposition for modelling historical change are as follows. The four parts of a quaternion can correspond to four key variables of society. If the solution turns out to have the form of a Quaternion exponential, it will generate the two types of historical change, linear and cyclical. And the rate of change of scale is then in antiphase with integration, organisation and cohesion, as we would expect. Now let us take this forward by considering the interaction between real and perceived states. We know that the real state affects the perceived state and vice versa. So a simple pair of equations we could try is r dot equals rp and P dot equals PR. Here we still have that the rate of change of the state is proportional to the existing state, but it now depends on P, which is not a constant. This suggests we will have solutions that still contain an exponential and cyclical part, but it will not be a simple Quaternion exponential. Since we don't expect history to follow a simple, straightforward exponential, this is moving in the right direction. Now, to justify these equations, I'll multiply out the first one. I won't go through everything because it would become too tedious, but I'll justify some of the parts of the resulting expression. So we would have S plus II plus OIJ plus CK dot R dot equals, and I'll put a subscript R for real, equals again SIO plus CKJI, and these are the real, so that's the real state multiplied by the perceived J I perceived. So we've got to multiply out these two brackets, and this will give us SR SP minus IR IP minus OR OP minus CR CP for the first term, plus SR IR OP minus OR IP K. So these are the expressions for the rate of change of scale, the rate of change of integration, the rate of change of organisation, and the rate of change of cohesion. So, does this make any sense? Well, first take the expression for rate of change of real scale. We see that scale increases with scale, both real and perceived, and decreases with integration, organisation, and cohesion. This is consistent with our earlier argument that scale feeds on itself, while integration, organisation, and cohesion inhibit the growth of scale. Second, take the expression for rate of change of real integration. The first term tells us that perceived integration tends to increase real integration. This is consistent with what we argued earlier, that the perception of integration, IP, makes integration easier to achieve in reality. This term also tells us that the effect depends on real scale, SR, which can be understood on the basis that high scale gives the political authority access to extensive societal resources, and these can more rapidly convert perceived power into real power. The second term tells us that real integration and perceived scale also increase real integration. This may be understood as saying that power accrues to the already powerful, though the role of perceived scale is less easily understood, and the meaning of perceived scale is itself open to question. The third and fourth terms tell us that real integration is increased by real organisation and perceived cohesion, and decreased by perceived organisation and real cohesion. To account for the third term, we could argue that real wealth is important to real power. The belief that you are wealthy is not enough. You have to have actual wealth, which translates into tanks, guns, armies, and all the trappings of real power. Cohesion enters the equation as reflecting loyalty and the legitimacy of the political authority. To extract wealth successfully and apply it to coercive mechanisms, the political authority needs legitimacy. It needs to enjoy the loyalty of its subjects. It is perceived loyalty because the subjects need to believe that they and the political authority have shared interests, even though in reality the political authority is focused on its own interest of accumulating power. As for the fourth term, we argued above that organisation tends to undermine integration, in that it involves activity outside the purview of the political authority, and the accumulation of wealth in private hands is a threat to that authority. Here the argument would be that it is perceived organisation that is important. People have to be aware of and recognise the influence their wealth gives them in order to be challenging to the political authority. Real cohesion enters the equation because the existence of mutual loyalty and shared interest inhibits the political authority from countering this organisation-derived influence. If we had had R dot equals PR instead of R dot equals RP, the third and fourth terms would have been the other way round due to the non-commutativity of Quaternion algebra. This form of the equations was therefore chosen because it is more sociologically plausible. Finally, consider the expression for rate of change of organisation. Here, the third term says that organisation is increased by perceived integration and real cohesion. Now, the involvement of perceived integration would make sense in that it was the perception, not just the reality of orderliness, that encouraged, say, traders in Roman Britain to become more adventurous. Real cohesion is important because, as Francis Fukuyama has shown, trust and shared values are a vital underpinning of capitalism. It is real cohesion because traders must actually trust each other, not just believe they do. And the fourth term says that organisation is decreased by real integration and perceived cohesion. This seems to correspond to what was argued earlier about political authorities extracting wealth from the economy and reducing incentives for economic activity. Perceived cohesion is involved because it is transfer payments that are most hostile to wealth creation. Taking wealth away from someone who has earned it and giving it to someone who has not earned it is particularly destructive of economic incentives. Such transfer payments, or social welfare payments, depend on a perception that the members of the community have shared interests and care for each other, i.e. on perceived cohesion, even if in reality people are actually behaving selfishly. Before leaving this equation, it is worth considering it from a dimensional perspective. In physics, we have dimensions like mass, length, and time. And the dimensions on both sides of an equation must be the same. It doesn't make sense to compare a mass, say, to a time. Now, we don't know what the dimension of a society's state is, so let's call it for the moment Z. On this side then we have Z divided by time, so Z t to the minus 1. And on the other side we have Z times Z, Z squared. So for this equation to be dimensionally consistent, we would have to have the dimension of the society state Z as t to the minus 1, an inverse time or frequency. This potentially makes sense. The individual components of the quaternion, because they are added, must all have the same dimension, which is also the dimension of the quaternion. Therefore, the dimension of the quaternion is the same as the dimension of scale, and scale is a measure of social interactivity, which could then be interpreted as a frequency, i.e. as a number of social interactions per unit time. Of course, if we decide that social state does not have the dimension of frequency, then we have more work to do in finding equations that are dimensionally consistent. Finally, to complete the model, we need to add in the external-internal interactions. How to do this is a matter for consideration. Purely by way of illustration, we might have equations something like this, where the index here refers to different levels of collective actors. So the rate of change at this level I depends on I minus 1 and I plus 1, and real and perceived. And these equations would then need to be solved recursively. I'll finish by reviewing 3 further issues for consideration, and then I will summarise the challenge. First, although I have not discussed it so far, integration, organisation and cohesion seem to be to some extent antagonistic. The more a society relies on integration, the less it can exhibit of organisation and cohesion. Now, quaternions can be used to represent rotations, in which case the imaginary part of the quaternion consists of a unit vector, i.e. it corresponds to a point on a unit sphere centred at the origin. If our state quaternions were constrained to be such rotations, acting on each other to generate further rotations, then integration, organisation and cohesion would indeed be antagonistic, since the closer the rotation moves, say, to the integration axis, the further it is from the organisation and cohesion axes. Second, I have been arguing for a model that generates exponential solutions with ever-increasing scale and ever-fluctuating integration, organisation and cohesion. However, some societies, such as those of the Australian Aborigines, who were still in the Old Stone Age when discovered by Europeans, seem to remain stable and unchanging. Clearly, if our model is to have any claim to be a correct description of historical processes, it should be able to explain societies like these. That is, it should be able to generate static solutions as well as exponential ones. Third, I mentioned at the start that the use of calculus may be inappropriate for modelling historical change. An alternative paradigm that I find attractive is that of self-organised criticality, because it involves an aperiodic build-up and release of tension that seems more akin to real historical change than the regular cycles generated by a set of differential equations. I therefore wonder if we could combine the quaternion representation with a dynamics based on self-organised criticality or something like it. To summarise, the challenge is as follows. 1. Use quaternion algebra to construct and solve a system of equations that expresses sociologically plausible dependencies between the variables and whose solutions combine linear and cyclical behaviour. And this consists of A. Decide what is represented by the 4 components of the quaternion, currently named integration, organisation, cohesion and scale, with scale most in need of clarification. B. Determine definitions, metrics and dimensions for these variables. C. Include a distinction between real and perceived states, with an interaction between them. And D. Include an interaction between the internal state of the actor and the external state of the higher level collective to which it belongs, and then solve the model recursively. 2. Consider how the equations can explain why some societies remain unchanged over long periods. And 3. Consider how the equations reproduce the Phoenix principle and whether a calculus-based dynamical systems approach is really suitable for this problem, or whether the approach can be adapted or combined with other methods.